Hello, everyone. Just as a warm up to the next segment, you will have by now seen a monochrome documentary film entitled Freedom for the Philippines, which was produced sometime in 1946 by Periscope Film, LLC Archive, one of the largest historic military, transportation, and aviation stock footage collections in the USA. The 23-minute film shows how the Japanese occupied the Philippines and how the US liberated the islands afterwards. While produced after the war, this film is no different from wartime propaganda reel made to motivate the civilian population to support the efforts of the troops. I hope you saw it in that light as well. Anyway, let's continue.
Welcome back to DZPFP and to the second segment of Part 2, Historical Background and Overview of Philippine External Relations. I'm Stephanie Soares, here's your host again with Mr. Derek Atienza, our guide and lecturer. So we're dialing through a couple years before continuing the thread about the Commonwealth of the Philippines, which is not quite finished yet due to a small historical hiccup called World War II. Specifically, we refer to the Pacific War, and in particular, the Japanese invasion and occupation of the Philippines.
Absolutely. While I'm tempted to use the term disruption on this occupation of the Philippines from 1942 by an Asian power by the use of force, in the same way I characterized the arrival of Europeans 420 years prior, there's probably a consensus that this event was simply a hiccup, as you characterized it, or an interruption of the wheels of history that had already begun to turn inexorably towards independence by 1941. Just before the eve of the Pacific War. I say that not to minimize or belittle the devastation and national trauma we experienced during the 3 years under Japanese occupation, but mostly because one can argue that ultimately it did not have such a huge impact in the psychology or attitudes of Filipinos, specifically the elite, in the way they proceeded with their efforts to finally gain the independence promised by the United States.
So here you're kind of giving us a preview also about what is going to take place afterwards. Of course, you will tell us through this segment what you mean by that. Our listeners will understand by 1941, a leadership impasse over the question of Quezon being able to get another term was generally resolved, right?
Yes, the 1935 Constitution was amended in 1940 to permit the re-election of Quezon as president and Osmeña as vice president, to restore the Senate, as you know, the National Assembly had been from 1935 just a unicameral legislature, and thus shift the legislature back to the bicameral system, and finally to establish a national electoral authority, the Commission on Elections. So these three were the efforts made or amendments that were made in the 1935 Constitution. Right down in 1940. Now, the proposed amendments were ratified in a plebiscite held on 18th June 1940. Presidential, legislative, and local elections were held on November 11th of November 1941. And as expected, Quezon and Osmeña won by a landslide against their rivals. However, even before they were formally inaugurated, war broke out. So as you can see, this was still played out following a script set by the Tidings-McDuffie Act with the consent and agreement of the Filipino public, of course.
And then the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. But due to the international dateline, this attack took place on the 8th of December 1941 in the Philippines.
Yes, but you have to remember that the attack by the Japanese, played up in American media reports as a surprise attack or a sneak attack, wasn't actually a surprise. In fact, the Japanese had clearly been a threat to the European hegemony in Asia for at least a generation before, due to concerns about Japanese expansionism just after World War I. As mentioned in the previous segment, certain Filipino politicians hesitated in pushing for a quick independence from the United States. By the time of the Jones Act, that is around 1916, by the time the Jones Act was passed, due to concerns about Japanese expansionism. And so the major Western powers tried to address these concerns through the Washington Naval Conference in 1922 and the London Naval Treaty of 1930. Japan joined the side of the Allied powers against the Central Powers in the First World War thanks to the Anglo-Japanese alliance. But after World War I, the developing Japanese American rivalry for control of the Pacific Ocean became a long term threat to world peace. So you have, on the one hand, Western powers trying to limit Japan, while on the other hand, Japan was asserting itself by taking over China and potentially all of Asia. So there was absolutely no surprise about the Japanese eventually taking over parts of Asia. This was such a concern too among Filipinos following reports of Japan's aggressive actions in China that the first policy, in fact, taken by the Commonwealth in 1935, of course, this is Commonwealth Act number 1, was to establish the Philippine Army and a national defense policy. By 1937, Japan had not just annexed Manchuria, but had gone on an all-out war against the rest of China. The following year, Germany annexed Sudetenland, that part of Czechoslovakia that was populated by German speakers from the time of the Austrian Empire. In 1939, Germany annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia and then invaded Poland in August, thus formally starting World War I. Since Japan was in a military alliance with Germany and Italy, which, by the way, had occupied Ethiopia since 1937 and attacked Greece in 1940, it was expected that Japan would enter the fray as well, sooner or later. Now, the main question was whether it would do so against the Soviet Union in order to fully secure China, or take the southward expansionist policy.
Oh boy. Well, basically, this is the scenario faced by the Commonwealth on the eve of the Pacific War, which essentially is part of the global conflict we refer to as Second World War. So, how did the Philippines and the United States prepare for this?
Well, if you remember, the external defense of the Philippines was still the responsibility of the United States, together with, of course, other matters such as currency, immigration, and foreign policy. Sensing a clear and present danger, the Commonwealth took whatever action it had the authority to take. First, the National Assembly conferred emergency powers on the government, which placed the Philippine Army under the command of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, or USAFE, which was led by Field Marshall, and this was a unique title given only to none other than Douglas MacArthur, who was ironically the son of the second to the last military governor of the Philippines in 1900, General Arthur MacArthur. Anyway, about Douglas MacArthur, there is just so much myth and mystique surrounding him, yet his reputation remains almost untarnished in the Philippines to this day. Yet when you look at his record, it's very mixed. He was certainly a larger-than-life figure, and by that I mean to say he was a megalomaniac narcissist, to put it in postmodern terms. Remember, he had the responsibility to prepare for the defense of the islands, as he was given authority by the Commonwealth government. Yet the Japanese attack of the Philippines took him and the USAFE by surprise, with most of the Air Force destroyed before any planes were able to take off the ground. And this is what you would call an unparalleled military disaster. According to a study conducted 50 years later, in the Philippines, the personnel of our armed forces, almost without exception, failed to assess accurately the weight, speed, and efficacy of the Japanese Air Force. So, without any cover, the U.S. Asiatic Fleet had no choice but to withdraw from Philippine waters to get out of harm's way, going first to Java and eventually heading to Australia. So overwhelming was the Japanese attack that Quezon had no choice but to declare Manila an open city, with hopes that the Japanese would spare it from the usual excesses of victorious conquering forces. And MacArthur didn't even stay to take responsibility. In March 1942, he was evacuated from Corregidor by PT boat to Mindanao, along with Quezon, Osmeña, and other high American and Filipino government officers. So in a way, MacArthur was able to cover for his failure by controlling the narrative. In this sense, actually giving this whole big speech about promising to return to the Philippines when he was already in Australia.
Of course, most Filipinos are aware about what happened later about the last stand in Bataan and Corregidor and the fall of the Philippines to the Japanese.
Yes, and I think it bears mentioning here that the Philippines was actually targeted by the Japanese primarily due to the American presence. So, yeah, that's a bit ironic. You see, the Japanese grand strategy was to expand its borders to help deal with its lack of self-sufficiency, in particular, its lack of natural resources. You know, Japan is just an island. Similar to the German concept of Lebensraum, the Japanese perceived the conquest of Asia and Oceania as their right as part of their southern expansion doctrine, which I had mentioned earlier. Initially guided by its northern expansion doctrine, Japan first attempted to take over the whole of China and to secure Chinese markets in the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. It eventually got bogged down in China and blamed the support for the Chinese resistance of the British and Americans, which benefited from its exploitation of its colonies in Southeast Asia. After its military setback in the Mongolian front and the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in 1941, Japan decided as part of its southern expansion doctrine to invade French Indochina, British Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies to provide raw materials for its industry and to attack the Philippines in this part to neutralize the threat posed by the United States, the biggest military force threatening its expansion in the Pacific. So one can argue that the whole plan for invading and occupying the Philippines was simply to prevent the US from using the Philippines as a staging ground so that it could aid its British, French, and Dutch allies in winning back their colonies. So with just a 16 million population, the Philippines didn't really limit it wasn't really too big to serve as a market, and it did not really limit its trade with Japan, which imported, among many things, Manila hemp used for rope in its merchant marine and naval vessels. There was also a sizable Japanese population in the Philippines, with Davao having at the time one of the biggest Japanese overseas communities outside Japan itself. So there was really little that the Japanese were interested in when they secured the Philippines, except perhaps driving away the Americans.
They were successful in doing that, but they did take much longer than was expected.
Yes, the Japanese certainly did not expect for the Philippine campaign to last as long as it did. In fact, the defense of the Philippines was the longest resistance to the Japanese Imperial Army in the initial stages of World War II, thus allowing Australia crucial time to organize for its defense. It took the Imperial Japanese Army 5 months instead of the envisioned 2 months.
So, how did Filipinos cope with the invasion and the occupation?
When the Commonwealth evacuated to Corregidor, Quezon left Manila Mayor Jorge B. Vargas in charge. So when the Japanese military commander of the Philippines, General Masaharu Homma, met Vargas, he appointed him chair of the caretaker government. And it's called the Philippine Executive Commission, which served as a provisional government to set up to govern the Philippine archipelago prior to the establishment of the Japanese-sponsored and nominally independent Second Philippine Republic. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many members of the Philippine elite cooperated with the occupying government, even aiding the Japanese by taking acquisition of key industries in the Philippine economy. But given Japan's waning fortunes, the longer the war dragged on, the Philippine economy eventually declined and declined rapidly, resulting in food shortages, hostility between the invaders and the invaded, and deaths from the spread of diseases. So there was a vicious cycle as the public's attitude towards the government became increasingly strained, and the Japanese government resorted to even harsher treatment of its subjects.
That's how the Imperial Japanese Army got its historical reputation for being cruel. It seems like a vicious cycle by this time for them. Was the growing hostility affecting their ability to manage the occupation?
To provide a moral and philosophical justification for its occupation, Japan introduced the concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which would essentially entail the creation of a self-sufficient bloc of Asian nations to be led, of course, by the Japanese, and would also be free from the rule of Western powers. So in fulfillment of this pan-Asianist objective, the Japanese established the nominally independent Republic of the Philippines, which was proclaimed on the 14th of October 1943, with Jose P. Laurel being sworn in as president. Interestingly, former President Emilio Aguinaldo and General Artemio Ricarte, who went on self-exile during the American colonial period to Japan, raised the Philippine flag at the same one used during the Philippine-American War during the inauguration of Laurel. This was the first time since the Japanese occupation that the flag was actually displayed and the Philippine anthem was played. On the same day, a pact of alliance was signed between the new Philippine Republic and the Japanese government that was ratified 2 days later by the newly re-established National Assembly. So, the Second Philippine Republic was immediately recognized by Japan, naturally, and in the succeeding days by, of course, Japanese allies Germany, Thailand, which was free and not occupied or colonized. There was Manchukuo, which is the Japanese occupied Manchuria, Burma, Croatia, and Italy, while neutral Spain sent its greetings. As it was nominally independent, the government could ostensibly chart its own foreign policy. And so, as you can imagine, in the cabinet, there was a Minister of Foreign Affairs in the person of Claro M. Recto. It was the first time the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was revived since the dissolution of the DFA in May 1899.
I am sure the Republic or the Japanese military occupation was also forced to make contributions to the war effort, no?
While the Philippines did not have the same economic resources as other territories in Southeast Asia, Japan did attempt to transform the Philippines as a source of agricultural products needed by its industry back home. For example, it tried to grow cotton and sugar lands with, of course, disastrous results. The Japanese army also tried using cane sugar for fuel, castor beans and copra for oil, derris for quinine, cotton for uniforms, and abaca for rope, as already mentioned. The plans were very difficult to implement in the face of limited skills by locals, collapsed international markets, bad weather, and transportation shortages. The program was a failure that gave very little help to Japanese industry and diverted resources necessary for food production.
So, in the end, did the Second Philippine Republic achieve any of its objectives for the country? Well, as dictated by the Japanese Governor General?
Well, the Second Philippine Republic was essentially little more than a puppet government established to serve the propaganda needs of the besieged Japanese, who by this time had not quite neutralized the US and instead, as a reverse effect, mobilized the US industrial capacity to fight a two-front war in Europe and in the Pacific. But Laurel did attend the Greater East Asia Conference, or also called the Tokyo Conference, an international summit held in Tokyo in November 1943, together with other heads of state of various component members of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This conference addressed few issues of substance, but was intended from the start as a propaganda showpiece to illustrate the Empire of Japan's commitments to the Pan-Asianism ideal and to emphasize its role as the quote-unquote liberator of Asia from Western colonialism. However, the conference did mark a turning point in Japanese foreign policy and relations with other nations. The turning of the tide against Japan in the war and an increasing awareness of the limitations to Japanese military strength led the civilian leadership of Japan to realize that a framework based on cooperation rather than colonial domination would enable a greater mobilization of manpower and resources against the resurgent Allied forces. It was also the start of efforts to create a framework that would allow for some form of diplomatic compromise should the military solution fail altogether. However, these moves came too late to save the Japanese Empire, which surrendered to the Allies less than 2 years after the Tokyo Conference.
I am curious, though, what other actions the Laurel government did that reflected its status as a puppet government and not independent republic?
Well, there was little else to do but to follow Japan's direction, especially when the situation worsened for Japan in 1944. The Allied campaign beginning August 1942 had driven Japanese forces by early 1944 from many of their island bases in the South and Central Pacific Ocean, while isolating their other bases, like in the Solomons and elsewhere. By mid-year, this offensive breached Japan's strategic inner defense ring and gave the Americans a base from which long-range bombers could attack the Japanese home islands. The Japanese counterattack in the Battle of the Philippine Sea eliminated the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to conduct large-scale carrier actions, making a U.S. invasion of the Philippines likely as a way for the Allies to cut Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia, and thus depriving them of fuel and the other necessities of war. And so, with an impending American invasion on the Philippines, Laurel placed the republic under martial law. And then he followed it up with an official declaration a few days later of war against the United States and United Kingdom. So if we recognize Laurel as our second president, and historically, and of course his government as legitimate because we're counting it, in the sequence of presidents and republics, it's curious to imagine that the Philippines actually was officially at war with the U.S. and the U.K. Although, of course, it was more of a formality.
But what about the guerrilla resistance in the Philippines? I'm sure it impacted on Japan's ability to control or govern the islands.
Yes, and that effort was definitely significant. Underground and guerrilla activity increased over the years, and that eventually covered a large portion of the country. While the Japanese tried to oppose these movements, by the end of the war, some 280 guerrilla units made up of 260,000 individuals were involved in the resistance, not counting, of course, the members of the anti-Japanese underground, which is practically almost everybody, regular folk who were against the Japanese occupation. They collectively provided so much intelligence to the Allies that the liberation forces managed a much smoother landing in Leyte in October 1944 than the D-Day landings in June 1944. Such was the effectiveness of the resistance and the guerrilla movement that by the end of the war, Japan controlled only 12 of 48 provinces. Imagine that. I don't think the guerrillas are given much credit for this. In fact, up to now, they're still fighting for benefits. At least those who are still alive. They're still fighting for benefits from the US government.
You're so right about that. That's particularly shameful. Speaking of the US responsibility, I remember a book released in April 2020, I believe, that shows how much of the devastation of the Philippines' capital city of Manila was partially a result of heavy US bombing.
I think you're referring to the nonfiction book Rampage, MacArthur, Yamashita, and the Battle of Manila by James M. Scott, who wrote about a miscalculation by MacArthur in his narcissistic desire to liberate Manila and have a victory parade down Dewey Boulevard, which is now Ross Boulevard. It's a bit strange, that whole retelling. This obsession by MacArthur with fulfilling his promise to return led to a premature victory announcement, in fact, which was followed by vicious door-to-door fighting between two of the world's most powerful armies. An estimated 100,000 to 240,000 Filipino civilians were killed, both deliberately by the Japanese in the Manila Massacre and from artillery and aerial bombardment by US and Japanese forces. In fact, Manila is second only to Stalingrad as being the city with the fiercest urban fighting during the war, and was one of the most devastated capital cities during the entire war, alongside Berlin and Warsaw. Unlike those two cities, however, I feel we have yet to recover what we have lost, the beauty and soul of this capital city, once called the Pearl of the Orient. Scott says, in fact, that Manila's devastation should count as a war crime of even greater magnitude than the rape of Nanjing. Another point I would very much like our listeners to understand and remember is that when one compares the total number of people killed between the Philippine-American War, which was around 200,000 to 1 million people, stretching, of course, over 14 years from 1899 to 1913, and those killed, the total number killed in the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, which was 500,000 over 3 years from 1942 to 1945, then one can say that there were potentially more Filipino casualties, especially civilian casualties, in the war against the Americans than in the war against the Japanese.
Is that true? So, why is it that we don't make a big fuss about the deaths in the Philippine American War?
The answer to that comes from a quote made in 1891 by a former Confederate congressman, Missouri Senator George Graham Best. He said, "History is written by the victors and framed according to the prejudices and biases existing on their side." So in this case, the atrocities of the Japanese is underscored to the detriment of an objective overview of history, which perhaps deserves more attention to the casualties of the Philippine-American War.
That is indeed apt. Is there any other takeaways you would like our listeners to remember from this segment?
Well, just this last part where I'd like to say that after the surrender of the Japanese throughout Asia, the peoples of various Asian countries took a different response to this development. In some countries where a power vacuum had developed, a struggle for liberation took place. This took the form of a civil war, for example, in China, between the nationalists and the communists. In India, this resulted in the acceleration of the process towards independence led by Gandhi, which would in turn lead to the partition of majority Hindu India and majority Muslim Pakistan in 1947. The disruptive forces that led to the granting of independence in India led to a similar process taking place in Burma, which is now Myanmar. In French Indochina, the French attempted to redefine its relationship with the emerging nations of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia through the establishment of a French Union. But this has not worked, and conditions deteriorated to a point where an all out war erupted by the end of 1946. The French Indochina War succeeded in throwing out the French from its Southeast Asian colonies by 1953 and 1954. Then finally, there's the Dutch East Indies. The power vacuum created by Japan's defeat led to the proclamation of Indonesian independence, where pro Republican forces took over from the defeated Japanese until the British, then the Dutch colonial forces arrived, by which time a national revolution for the liberation of Indonesia from Dutch rule had erupted. And this was accompanied by deft diplomacy on the part of the Indonesians to convince other nations that the Dutch really had to leave. So by December 1949, Indonesia attained independence in international recognition as a republic. In contrast, there are others, the Philippines among them, who welcomed the liberating colonial powers like in Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore. For us, the return of US forces and the defeat of the Japanese was just the restoration of the Commonwealth, the righting of a wrong, the return to the old normal, as one can put it. And that's what we're going to pick off from in the next segment.
You're right. Well, this has been a long segment indeed, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned. I hope our listeners picked up on them and remember them, especially in future discussions about the topic. With this podcast, they should be able to review and replay whatever part might be unclear. Of course, they could always write down their questions and ask you either by email or in the discussion at the next synchronous session.
That's absolutely right. Thank you so much for reminding our listeners about that opportunity that up to now no one has really taken advantage of. Anyway, lots more to discuss in the next segment.
Yes, so keep tuned to the next one. In the meantime, this is Stephanie Soares signing out from the DZ PFP. Catch you all later.